Freud, together with Marx, was classified as the two masters of suspicion of the 19th century. I think this was very, very apt, because one attacked the concept of society and its economic structures, and the other attacked the concept of the human mind as being entirely a conscious organ, and that what you heard, what people said, what people thought was the beginning, middle and end of it. And they both, in their own way, had huge effects on society and the concept of the individual right throughout the 20th century, but both have rather gone into decline in the 21st century. There are very few states that would now declare themselves genuinely as socialist, and the interest in psychoanalysis, which peaked particularly in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, has now become very, very marginalised. The reasons for this are extremely complex. One of them is actually financial, because the cost of analysis is huge, but it is only because of the wealth of the United States and the fashion of psychoanalysis that enabled the bulk of work in psychoanalysis to be done and recorded in the work of the major analysts of the 20th century. To go back to what I was saying at the beginning, in the idea of Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, we get the beginnings, the first articulation of something which would take 500 years to be overthrown. Because I think what was being said by Descartes was, I think because I am, it missed out being. And being is feeling, as well as being a kind of conscious understanding conceptually, an articulation of that in the world we live in. And society lived at two different levels. I'm not talking about the rich and the poor. I'm talking about what people accepted as behaviour and how people actually behaved. The hypocrisy, the smugness, the lies, the hidden prostitution, the hidden exploitation of children, all these things were a part of 19th century middle class and upper middle class Europe. Whether it's Vienna, Berlin, Paris or London, it made no difference. Freud began as a neurologist, but there was no family money to support him in this, and he needed an income to support his wife and his children, and he began to realise that certain patients had symptoms that could not realistically have a physical, that is to say, an organic cause. Patients suddenly developed the inability to speak and the inability to actually relate in a normal way to other people. The concepts of lunacy, of course, had gone back thousands of years, but this is not what Freud really was talking about. Freud did talk about psychotic illness, but he regarded it as beyond the pale of the kind of investigation that psychoanalysis was, in his view, about. This later was challenged, as were all Freud's views. One thing that is particularly interesting about Freud is he actually invented psychoanalysis. Marx did not invent economic theory. I don't think any one person did. No one person invented physics or medicine or chemistry. But to Freud and to Freud alone, we must attribute psychoanalysis. Whatever its faults, it is to me one of the most interesting and fascinating subjects on earth. I've only had two great passions in my life. One was for poetry and the other was for psychoanalysis, and they are strangely complementary. I came across psychoanalysis quite by accident. I found 10 volumes of a book called The Psychoanalytic Study of the Child in a book sale in Allsticks University bookshop somewhere in about 1970, which I bought for £10, which was a fraction of what the cost. The book is still published annually, and I think the cost is £52 per volume. What psychoanalysis is about is our secret lives. Not just secrets we keep from each other and from society, but secrets we keep from ourselves. But how we keep those secrets, what those secrets are, these conceptions have changed immensely since Freud's first book was published around about 1890, co-published with an author called Breuer. But Breuer became very frightened of psychoanalysis when a patient he was treating accused him of fathering a child. She wasn't actually pregnant, it was a hysterical pregnancy, pseudocyesis, but Breuer rapidly decamped and left Freud to fight the battle alone. He did get round himself a number of people who shared his ideas that there was an unconscious mind which was often completely at variance with a conscious mind. Some of these people were rich, most of them were Jewish, they were all German speaking, and they began to have a very powerful effect on the intellectual undercurrents of Europe. Freud was not popular. He was a polymath. He could write fluently in Latin, he could understand Greek, and he certainly was one of the cleverest minds of his age. But he suffered from a great deal of unpopularity, even amongst, and particularly amongst his fellow Jewish doctors in Vienna, because to combat current anti-Semitism they treated the poor for nothing, and Freud was not in a position financially to do this. However, Freud did begin to attract followers not just in the German-speaking world, but abroad, particularly in England. And there have always been differences, there have always been schisms, rather like the church. Freud attracted followers, but some of the followers disagreed with Freud, some of the followers were thrown out by Freud, and one, Carl Gustav Jung, turned out to be a Nazi and a very, very nasty piece of work, having taken the mantle of president of the German Psychoanalytic Association from the hand of the Nazis. He later described himself as an Aryan Christ, so one can imagine what Jung really was. Freud began to work with patients who could afford, or whose families could afford, Freud to see them 5 or 6 days a week for an hour. And in this hour, Freud developed what was called, by one of his patients, the talking cure. And Freud insisted, he didn't allow, he insisted, that the patient free associated. That is, the patient said the first thing that came into the person's mind. And Freud was aware very quickly that there was an unconscious censorship at work. The patient would say something and then fall into silence and say something again, and Freud would then begin to actually interpret what he believed the patient was actually talking about. His early theories were in a sense quite crude, and perhaps the patient population now is more subtle. If a patient said he developed a pain in his leg the day he had to pay a visit to his mother-in-law, Freud would rapidly see that the pain was not organic, but was what he called a conversion symptom. The patient did not want to visit his mother-in-law, and therefore conveniently developed a pain to explain away the reason why he couldn't go. This does sound to modern ears extremely crude, and I don't think really analysts would expect to come across these symptoms in the 21st century, but at the time this was absolutely revolutionary. Also, Freud developed theories of childhood sexuality. which were actually challenged and are no longer entirely agreed with by many analysts, because Freud's original teaching was there are two strata to the mind: the unconscious, which he described as the id, and the conscious. He then changed his mind and developed the tripartite theory, the unitary theory, which became known as ego psychology in America, which was an id, which was a kind of cauldron of seething aggression and sexuality, a conscious mind, which was not entirely purely conscious, but which parts of the unconscious seeped into to affect people's speech and their actions, and a third agency, the superego, which might be called crudely as a conscience. And the problem was Freud realised that the superego, which is supposed to be full in Christian thought of lovingness, tended to be fueled by aggression and not by compassion. This is why people who are full of religious fundamentalists, for instance, and extreme religionists have very harsh theories, because it's fueled by aggression and not by any kind of Christian compassion. The problem with psychoanalysis is it is extremely complex. I've spent 37 years reading it, and every week I read something new, which makes me think again, was what I believed a week ago correct? But there are some basic ideas which have never changed. One is what's called the transference. The transference is the rapport, the two-way speech, the two-way discourse between the patient and the analyst. The patient became known as the analysand, because to some extent psychoanalysis has become demedicalised. Freud himself never believed, nor did his early followers, that psychoanalysis should have as a prerequisite for training a medical degree. Freud's own daughter, Anna, was a nursery school teacher, and her greatest opponent, Melanie Klein, was also a nursery school teacher. And these were just simply people who had a natural gift for psychoanalysis. And this is one of the great problems in psychoanalysis, that when it was migrated to America, the medical profession took charge of it and absolutely forbade anyone who was not a medical doctor to practice psychoanalysis, totally contrary to Freud's own thinking. Freud and Jung were invited to an American university in the early 1900s, and Freud said to Jung, as he stood on board a boat travelling, "We are taking the plague with us, but they don't know it." Certainly, this was not just to America, but to England also. Freud's words spread to, of all people, the literary Bloomsbury set. Alex Strachey and Lytton Strachey and other members of the Bloomsbury group became very, very interested in psychoanalysis, and one of the Stracheys became Freud's translator. He himself admitted he'd only a third-class degree from a provincial university, but he simply wrote to Freud out of the blue, and Freud accepted him for training and qualified him, and he was one of the primary movers in the formation of the British Psychoanalytical Society. Dreams were, for Freud, a major influence, a major way of going into the conduit of the unconscious. People's dreams are anxiety dreams, wish fulfillment dreams, traumatic dreams. They're not exactly totally, usually unreal. They bear some connection with reality, usually through the interpretation of symbols. And how this is done is entirely a matter of the here and now, between the patient and the analyst. There are many people who have published dream books that say a certain symbol means a certain thing. But this is not Freud's idea. Freud believed that a symbol meant something in the context of the ongoing relationship between the patient and the analyst. This was